Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I had just gotten my first solo apartment a few months before everything went to hell. Finally able to afford living alone, after years of splitting rent with roommates who never did their dishes. It was September 2022, and I'd been in this one-bedroom unit in a quiet building near downtown Columbus since May, working from home as a medical transcriptionist and genuinely enjoying the peace and quiet. The building was one of those pre-war constructions with thick plaster walls that actually did their job. You could barely hear anything from the other apartments, which was perfect for someone like me who needed complete silence to focus on audio files and medical terminology. Most of my neighbors were either retired folks or other young professionals who minded their own business, and the building manager, an older guy named Frank, kept everything running smoothly. I was 28, and finally feeling like a real adult with my name on a lease, my own furniture, and nobody else's mess to clean up. Everything changed when the guy in apartment 2B moved in that August, right next door to my unit, 2A. From day one, there was something unsettling about him beyond just the noise issue that would eventually develop. He had this peculiar habit of standing in the hallway for long periods, not doing anything, just standing there breathing heavily like he'd run a marathon. I'd catch glimpses of him through my peephole sometimes when I heard footsteps stop outside my door. A tall, lanky man, probably in his 40s, with greasy shoulder-length hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He never made eye contact with anyone in the building, always kept his head down, but you could feel him watching you once you passed him. The elderly couple across the hall, the Andersons, mentioned to me once that they'd seen him carrying in strange equipment at odd hours. Industrial-looking cases and metal pipes that seemed too heavy for normal household use. The noise started about 3 weeks after he moved in, always between midnight and 4 in the morning. This rhythmic mechanical grinding that would pulse through the wall we shared. It wasn't music or television or even normal construction sounds. It was something else entirely, like heavy machinery being operated in intervals, 15 minutes on, 10 minutes off, over and over again. The sound would vibrate through my bedroom wall, making sleep impossible, and I'd lie there trying to figure out what the hell someone could be doing at that hour that would create such a specific pattern of noise. I tried earplugs, white noise machines, even moved my bed to the opposite wall, but nothing helped because the vibration seemed to travel through the floor and ceiling too. After 2 weeks of this torture, averaging maybe 3 hours of sleep a night, I was exhausted and desperate, making stupid mistakes in my transcription work that I'd never made before. That Friday night in mid-September, when the grinding started up at exactly midnight like clockwork, I finally had enough and called the police to file a noise complaint. The dispatcher sounded bored, probably dealt with these calls all the time, but she said they'd send someone over when they had a unit available. I watched through my peephole as 2 officers showed up about an hour later, knocked on 2B's door, and had what looked like a brief, calm conversation with my neighbor, though I couldn't hear what was being said. The noise stopped immediately after they left, and for the first time in weeks I got a full night's sleep, thinking maybe the problem was finally solved. I even left a polite note under his door the next morning, apologizing for involving the police but explaining that I really needed quiet to work and sleep, trying to smooth things over like a reasonable adult. Saturday passed without incident. No noise, no encounters in the hallway, nothing unusual at all. And I actually started to relax, caught up on some overdue transcription assignments, and even went out for drinks with a friend that evening. When I got home around 10 that night, slightly buzzed and in a good mood for the first time in weeks, I noticed something on my doormat that definitely hadn't been there when I left. It was a plain manila envelope, no markings, no address, no stamps, just sitting there perfectly centered on the welcome mat like someone had placed it with deliberate care. I picked it up, noticed it was light, almost weightless, and figured maybe it was from the building manager, or possibly even an apology note from my neighbor. The hallway was dead silent as I unlocked my door, and I remember thinking how nice it was to finally have peace and quiet again. How maybe things would go back to normal now. Inside my apartment, I tossed my keys on the counter and opened the envelope while walking toward my bedroom, pulling out what appeared to be a single photograph, printed on regular computer paper. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing, because it made no sense. It was a picture of someone sleeping in a bed, taken from above at an angle, like whoever took it had been standing at the foot of the bed looking down. The person in the photo was lying on their side, face partially visible against the pillow, wearing a white t-shirt I recognized immediately, because it had a small coffee stain near the collar that I'd been meaning to bleach out. My legs went weak as I realized I was looking at myself, asleep in my own bed, in my own room, photographed by someone who had been standing right there, maybe 3 feet away from where I'd been unconscious and completely vulnerable. The walls of my apartment suddenly felt paper thin, like they couldn't protect me from anything, and I had to grab the doorframe to steady myself as the full implications hit me. With trembling fingers, I flipped the photo over and found a timestamp printed on the back in small black numbers. Friday, September 16th, 2022, 1:47 a.m. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears as I realized that was last night, less than 24 hours ago, about 30 minutes after the police had left, and I'd finally fallen asleep. Someone had been in my apartment, in my bedroom, standing over me while I slept, close enough to touch me, and I hadn't woken up, hadn't heard anything, hadn't even stirred. I ran to my bedroom and checked everything. The window was still locked from the inside. The bedroom door showed no signs of tampering. Nothing was out of place or missing. My laptop and wallet were still on the nightstand exactly where I'd left them. The only evidence that someone had been there was this photo. This impossible photo that shouldn't exist, taken by someone who had somehow gotten into my locked apartment without leaving a trace. I immediately called 911 again, this time reporting a break-in. My voice shaking so badly the dispatcher had to ask me to repeat myself twice. While waiting for the police, I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and went through every inch of my apartment, checking closets, behind the shower curtain, under the bed, anywhere someone could possibly hide. The same 2 officers from the night before showed up, and I could see the skepticism in their eyes when they recognized me, probably thinking I was some paranoid troublemaker trying to get back at my neighbor. But when I showed them the photo, their expressions changed completely, especially when the younger one pointed out something I hadn't noticed in my panic. In the background of the photo, barely visible in the darkness, you could see the reflection of the camera flash in my bedroom mirror. And in that reflection, there was the vague outline of a figure holding up a phone. They took the photo as evidence, dusted for fingerprints around my door and windows, and told me they'd question the neighbor again. But we all knew there was no real proof he was the one who'd taken it. After the police left, there was no way I was staying in that apartment alone, so I packed a bag with shaking hands and called my friend Kevin to ask if I could crash at his place for a few nights. While throwing clothes into my duffel bag, I kept checking every corner of my bedroom, paranoid that someone might still be watching, and that's when I noticed something that made my knees buckle. My bedroom door had one of those old-fashioned keyholes, the kind you could look through if you wanted to, and there were fresh scratch marks around it on the hallway side, like someone had been picking at the paint with their fingernails. But what really got me was when I bent down to look closer. There were smudges on the brass keyhole cover, greasy fingerprints that caught the light, and when I looked through the keyhole from the hallway side, I had a perfect view of my bed. Someone had been watching me through that keyhole, probably for weeks, learning my sleep patterns, waiting for the perfect moment. Kevin picked me up within 20 minutes, and I spent that night on his couch, jumping at every little sound, unable to close my eyes without seeing that photo in my mind. The next morning, running on 0 sleep and pure adrenaline, I went straight to the building manager Frank's office and told him everything, showed him copies I'd made of the photo before giving the original to the police. Frank went pale when he saw it, immediately started talking about changing locks and installing security cameras, But then he said something that made everything click into place in the worst possible way. He mentioned that the previous tenant of 2B had moved out suddenly after complaining about someone entering his apartment while he was at work, finding things moved around, food missing from his refrigerator, and once even finding muddy footprints leading from his bedroom to the bathroom that weren't his shoe size. Frank had dismissed it as paranoia at the time, thought maybe the guy was having mental health issues, but now he was starting to wonder if there was something more to it, maybe something involving the building's maintenance access, or the old servants' passages that had been sealed up decades ago but might still have weak points. That afternoon, Frank called in a contractor to inspect the walls between apartments 2A and 2B, and what they found still gives me nightmares when I think about it. Behind my bedroom closet, which shared a wall with 2B, there was a panel that had been carefully cut and replaced, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look and press. It opened into a narrow space between the walls, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways, filled with old insulation and decades of dust, except for one area that showed clear signs of recent disturbance. A path worn through the grime, fresh scratches on the wooden beams, and horrifyingly, a small pile of candy wrappers and empty water bottles stashed in the corner. The contractor followed the passage and found it connected not just our two apartments, but ran through the entire length of the building, with access points cut into several units, all done with precision tools that explained the grinding noise I'd been hearing. My neighbor hadn't been making noise to annoy me. He'd been cutting his way into the walls, creating his own private network of passages to watch and visit whoever he wanted, whenever he wanted. The police arrested him that same day, found him in his apartment surrounded by hundreds of photos printed on cheap computer paper. Pictures of me, the Andersons, the young couple in 1A, even Frank checking the mail, all taken without our knowledge over the past month. His laptop had folders organized by apartment number, each containing detailed notes about our schedules, when we showered, when we took out trash, when we were deepest in sleep, everything documented with a patience that made me physically sick to read about later in the police report. They also found recording equipment, tiny cameras, and worst of all, a key-making kit with impressions for multiple apartments, though the passages had made those unnecessary. He never said a word during the arrest, just stared at the officers with this blank expression, and even now, after everything that's come out, nobody knows why he did it, what he was planning, or if photographing us sleeping was the extent of it, or just the beginning of something worse. I moved out the next week, broke my lease without penalty given the circumstances, and found a new place across town, a modern building with security cameras and a doorman who checks everyone who enters. The guy from 2B got 18 months in prison for criminal trespass and stalking, which seems like nothing considering what he put us all through. But at least he's on the registry now and has a restraining order keeping him away from all of us who lived in that building. Sometimes I still wake up at night thinking I hear that grinding sound, and I compulsively check my closets for hidden panels, run my fingers along the walls looking for seams that shouldn't be there. The Andersons moved to Florida to be closer to their kids. The young couple in 1A broke their lease too, and last I heard, Frank was having trouble finding new tenants, even after having all the walls professionally sealed and installing a complete security system. What haunts me most isn't just that he was watching us, but wondering how many other buildings have someone like him, carefully cutting through walls in the middle of the night, creating their own secret network of passages, documenting the lives of people who think they're safe in their own homes. I sleep with my bedroom door locked now, a chair wedged under the handle, and a camera pointing at my bed that uploads to the cloud, because I learned the hard way that walls and locks don't mean anything if someone wants to watch you badly enough. My electric toothbrush was facing the wrong direction that morning. Sounds stupid, right? But when you charge the same blue Oral-B in the exact same spot every single night for 2 months, you notice when it's suddenly pointing at the wall instead of the mirror. I stood there in my pajamas, holding my coffee mug with the chipped handle, staring at it like it might explain itself. The bathroom still reeked of that persistent mildew smell that no amount of bleach could kill, and somewhere in the walls, the old pipes were doing their morning gurgle routine. Jason's door was closed, had been since I woke up. He usually got home from his warehouse shift around 4 in the morning, slept until noon, then disappeared again by the time I got back from work. We'd been sharing this creaky Victorian on Birch Avenue since July, and I could count on one hand the number of actual conversations we'd had. The thing about Jason was that he moved through the house like smoke. In 2 months of living one thin wall away from him, I'd never heard him sneeze, cough, or even clear his throat. Sometimes I'd come out of my room and he'd just be standing in the kitchen, so still and quiet that I'd actually gasp when I noticed him. He'd do this slow blink thing, like a reptile processing whether you're prey or not, then go back to whatever he was doing, usually eating cereal straight from the box or staring at his phone with the screen brightness turned way down. 30-something years old and built like someone had stretched a normal person out on a rack, all gangly limbs and sharp elbows, but harmless. Or at least that's what I kept telling myself whenever that little alarm bell went off in my head. After the toothbrush incident, more things started being out of place. My favorite sweater, this oversized burgundy thing I'd stolen from an ex, was folded differently in my drawer. Not messy, just different. The sleeves tucked under instead of over, like someone who didn't know my system had carefully put it back. Then my perfume bottle migrated 3 inches to the left on my dresser. My laptop charger got wrapped with the cord going clockwise instead of counterclockwise. Little things that made me feel like I was going crazy, because who the hell would notice which way their charger cord was wrapped? But when you live alone in your own space, even with a roommate in the house, you develop these unconscious patterns. And when those patterns get disrupted, your brain starts firing off warning signals even if you can't articulate exactly what's wrong. I started testing myself, taking photos of my room before leaving for work each morning. Phone propped against my mirror, capturing my desk, my dresser, my nightstand, even the way my shoes lined up by the door. Then I'd compare them when I got home, zooming in like some kind of detective, looking for differences. Most days, nothing. But then on a Friday, 2 weeks after the toothbrush thing, I caught it. My hairbrush had rotated maybe 45 degrees. The book on my nightstand, some self-help garbage about reclaiming your power after trauma that my sister had given me, was closed, even though I distinctly remembered leaving it open, pages down, to hold my place because I'd lost the receipt I was using as a bookmark. These weren't things that could happen from the house settling or vibrations from trucks outside. Someone had been in my room. The rational part of my brain kept making excuses. Maybe I was stressed from the Johnson campaign at work. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Maybe I had some kind of weird memory problem. I even Googled carbon monoxide poisoning symptoms, because I'd read this Reddit thread once about someone who kept finding creepy notes in their apartment that turned out to be from themselves during co-induced blackouts. Bought a detector that same day, $23 at Home Depot, and installed it in my room. The levels were fine. Everything was fine. Except I knew it wasn't. That crawling sensation you get when someone's watching you? I had it constantly now, even when Jason wasn't home, especially in my room, like the walls themselves had absorbed someone's attention and were playing it back on a loop. I tried the logical approach first, changed my door handle to one with a lock. Jason didn't say anything about it when we passed in the hallway, just did his signature slow blink and shuffled to the kitchen. Started keeping my valuable stuff in a lockbox under my bed, jewelry, passport, the emergency cash my dad insisted I keep hidden. But the little disturbances continued. A single hair tie moved from my nightstand to my desk. My face wash turned backward in the shower caddy, my pillow slightly off-center on the bed. Whoever was doing this wasn't interested in stealing from me. They just wanted to touch my things, to leave these tiny fingerprints on my life that only I would notice. It was like living with a ghost who got their kicks from gaslighting you. Except ghosts don't eat Lucky Charms at 2 in the morning or leave their work boots by the front door. The camera was $49 on Amazon, this tiny thing that looked like a phone charger cube. I set it up on a Sunday when Jason was at work, positioned it on my bookshelf between a fake plant and some old college textbooks I'd never thrown away. The angle captured most of my room: the bed, the door, the dresser. The app sent clips to my phone whenever it detected motion. The first few days were just me getting ready in the morning, coming home and flopping on my bed. Normal stuff. I started to feel stupid, paranoid, like maybe I really was just stressed and imagining things. Then Wednesday night happened. I was at my friend Megan's place for her birthday dinner, one of those wine and pasta nights that stretched until midnight. Jason would definitely be at work. He always left by 7:30 sharp. But at 9:47 p.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert. The video was 18 seconds long, and I watched it right there at Megan's dining table while everyone else was arguing about whether pineapple belonged on pizza. The quality was grainy in the low light, but clear enough to see my bedroom door slowly open. A figure stood in the doorway for a full 5 seconds, just a dark silhouette against the hallway light. Then Jason, unmistakably Jason with his too tall frame and mantis-like posture, stepped inside. He moved weird, like he was walking through water or trying not to disturb the air molecules. He went straight to my bed, stood beside it for 3 seconds, then carefully, deliberately sat down on my floor, right beside the bed. The video cut off there because he'd stopped moving enough to trigger the motion sensor. But I knew he was still there, just sitting, in the dark, next to where I sleep. I left Megan's immediately, made up some excuse about food poisoning, and drove to the 24-hour Walmart parking lot. Sat there in my car with the doors locked, going through every video from the past 3 days with this sick weight in my stomach. There were more, so many more. Every single night Jason had come into my room, sometimes at 10, sometimes at 2 in the morning, but always the same routine. Enter slowly, walk to my bed, sit on the floor. The camera only caught him in clips when he moved, but by comparing the timestamps I figured out he was staying in there for hours. 3 hours one night, 4.5 another, just sitting on my floor in the dark, facing my bed, completely still. In one video from Monday night, the infrared picked up his face when he shifted slightly. His eyes were open, staring directly at where my head would be on the pillow. Not sleeping, not on his phone, just watching the space where I would have been. The worst part was finding myself in the footage. There I was, dead asleep, sprawled across my bed with my mouth probably open, completely defenseless while this man sat 3 feet away from me in the darkness. In one clip from Saturday night, I turned over in my sleep, arm hanging off the bed, fingers nearly touching the floor where he sat. He didn't move away. He just stayed perfectly still, letting my hand dangle inches from him. Another video showed him doing something with his hands near his face. It took me 6 replays to realize he was smelling something. My hair tie, the one that had been moved from my nightstand. He'd been collecting them, these little pieces of me, and just sitting there in the dark, breathing them in while I slept above him, completely unaware. I called the police from that Walmart parking lot, but what do you even say? A grown man entering my room at night without permission was enough to get them interested at least. 2 officers met me back at the house at 1 in the morning. Jason's shift would keep him away until 4. They took my statement, watched the videos, and one of them actually went pale when he saw the footage of Jason just sitting there, staring. They helped me grab my essential stuff while we waited for the emergency protective order paperwork to go through. I remember the younger cop kept checking behind doors as we packed, like he expected Jason to materialize from the shadows. They waited while I stuffed clothes into garbage bags, grabbed my laptop, my documents, anything I couldn't replace. The older officer told me I was smart to get out, that these situations tend to escalate, that people who violate boundaries like this rarely stop on their own. He said it real quiet, like he'd seen where this kind of thing leads. I stayed at Megan's place that night, and for 2 weeks after while I searched for a new apartment. The landlord let me break the lease without penalty after the police explained the situation. Jason was evicted within a week. Turns out I wasn't the first complaint, just the first with video evidence. Megan came with me to get the rest of my stuff on a Saturday afternoon. Broad daylight, Jason long gone according to the landlord. But his room door was open, and I couldn't help looking inside as we passed. The walls were covered, absolutely covered, with photos printed on regular paper. All of rooms, not just mine, but previous tenants' rooms too, based on the different furniture. All taken from floor level, as if someone was sitting on the ground looking up at empty beds. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, overlapping like scales. In the center, newer than the rest, were screenshots from my social media, pictures I'd posted of myself in my room, selfies on my bed, but edited somehow, zoomed in on my sleeping face in the background of a mirror selfie I'd taken months ago. How long had he been planning this? How many others had there been before me? I never got those answers because Jason disappeared completely after the eviction. The police said he'd given a fake last name on the lease, paid rent in cash, and the warehouse had no record of him working there. Sometimes I still dream about those hours he sat in my room, and I wake up checking the floor beside my bed, even though I live alone now in a studio apartment with 3 deadbolts and a security system. Sometimes I still feel like someone's watching me sleep, but at least now I know it's just the ghost of that fear, not a real person sitting in the darkness, breathing in the scent of my life. The house on Hawthorne Lane wasn't much to look at. Yellow siding that needed repainting, a cramped kitchen with outdated appliances, and a yard so small you could mow it in 5 minutes flat. But for a 26-year-old veterinary assistant trying to save money, it was exactly what I needed. I'd been working at the animal clinic downtown for about 8 months when I found the rental listing, and the price was too good to pass up. Moving day was a Saturday in August. Just me and a borrowed pickup truck full of second-hand furniture and cardboard boxes labeled in my messy handwriting. The neighborhood seemed quiet, almost sleepy, with kids riding bikes in lazy circles and sprinklers clicking across brown lawns. I remember thinking how normal everything looked, how perfectly suburban and safe, the kind of place where people probably still left their doors unlocked. That first week I kept busy unpacking and trying to make the place feel like home, hanging curtains and scrubbing years of grime off the bathroom tiles. My neighbor to the left was a man named Douglas Harmon, probably in his early 50s, with thinning gray hair that he always combed straight back with too much gel. He worked at the local hardware store. I'd seen him there when I bought paint for my bedroom, and drove a beige Toyota Camry that he washed every Sunday morning at exactly 8:30. Douglas had this peculiar way of smiling, where only the corners of his mouth moved up while his eyes stayed completely flat, like someone had taught him the mechanics of smiling, but not the actual emotion behind it. He'd wave when he saw me getting my mail, always the same rigid motion like he was signaling a plane for landing. The thing that struck me most about Douglas was how methodical he was about everything. His lawn was cut in perfect diagonal stripes, his garbage cans were always placed exactly 3 feet from the curb, and every single night at 9:15, he'd walk out to his backyard shed with a heavy padlock and secure it with 3 separate clicks that I could hear through my bedroom window. At first, I didn't think much about the shed routine. Plenty of people lock up their tools or lawn equipment, especially in neighborhoods where teenagers might get bored and start poking around. But after a few weeks, I started noticing other things about Douglas and that weathered wooden structure at the back of his property. The shed itself was maybe 8 by 10 feet, painted the same faded green as his house trim, with a single window covered from the inside by what looked like aluminum foil. He'd check that padlock in the morning before leaving for work, sometimes pulling on it 2 or 3 times to make sure it held. On weekends, he'd spend hours out there with the door cracked just wide enough for him to slip through, and I'd hear the faint sound of shuffling papers and the occasional metallic scrape. Once when I was trimming the bushes along our shared fence line, he came out so fast when he heard me that he left the shed door swinging open for maybe 2 seconds before he yanked it shut and gave me that mechanical smile, asking if I needed to borrow any gardening tools. The really strange part started about 2 months after I moved in, on a Wednesday afternoon in early November. I'd called in sick to work because of a nasty stomach bug that had me running to the bathroom every hour. Around 3 in the afternoon, I was lying on my couch trying to keep down some crackers when I heard Douglas's car pull into his driveway, way earlier than his usual 6 o'clock return. Through the thin curtains, I watched him practically sprint to his backyard, fumbling with his keys like his fingers weren't working right. He unlocked the shed and disappeared inside for maybe 20 minutes, then emerged carrying a cardboard box that he held against his chest with both arms, the way you'd carry something fragile or precious. He loaded it into his trunk and drove off again, but not before I noticed him checking his rearview mirror 3 times before backing out, scanning the street like he expected someone to be watching. That night, the shed-locking ritual happened at 9:15 as always, but this time he added a second padlock to the door, one of those circular ones that are supposed to be impossible to cut. I know I should have minded my own business, but living alone in a new place makes you hyper-aware of everything around you, especially when your neighbor starts acting like he's guarding state secrets in a backyard shed. I found myself creating excuses to be in my yard whenever Douglas was home, watering plants that didn't need water, checking a mailbox I knew was empty, pretending to look for a lost earring in the grass near the fence. He caught me watching once, just stood there in his backyard holding a black garbage bag, staring at me with those empty eyes for what felt like a full minute before he asked if I'd seen any stray cats around. The question came out of nowhere, and when I said no, he nodded slowly and said that was good, because he'd hate for any animals to get into his shed and make a mess of his important documents. The way he emphasized important documents made my skin prickle, like he was warning me without actually warning me. After that encounter, I started keeping my blinds closed more often, but I could still hear him out there every night, checking those locks like his life depended on it. The storm hit on a Saturday night in late November, one of those sudden November storms that comes out of nowhere, with winds that make your windows rattle and rain that sounds like someone throwing gravel at your roof. I was in bed reading when the power flickered twice and then went out completely, leaving me in that thick darkness where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. I fumbled for my phone and used the flashlight to find some candles in the kitchen, and that's when I heard it, a loud bang from Douglas's backyard, the unmistakable sound of wood hitting wood. Through my kitchen window, I could see his shed door had blown open and was slamming against the frame with each gust of wind. The strange thing was, Douglas's house was completely dark too, but his car wasn't in the driveway. He'd left about an hour earlier, which I only knew because I'd heard his car door slam and the engine start up. The shed door kept banging, and I kept staring at that dark rectangle of the doorway, telling myself it was none of my business, that I should just go back to bed and let Douglas deal with it when he got home. But the banging wouldn't stop, and after 15 minutes of listening to it, I couldn't take it anymore. I put on my rain jacket and grabbed the flashlight I kept in my junk drawer, the heavy metal one my dad had given me when I first moved out on my own. The rain hit me sideways the second I stepped outside, soaking through my pajama pants in seconds. I climbed over the low fence between our yards. Douglas didn't have a gate on my side, and my bare feet squelched in the muddy grass as I made my way to the shed. The door was swinging wildly, and I had to time it right to grab the handle without getting smacked in the face. When I finally caught it and pulled it fully open, my flashlight beam swept across the interior, and for a second I thought I was seeing things wrong, that the rain was distorting my vision somehow. The walls were completely covered, floor to ceiling, with laminated pieces of paper arranged in perfect rows, like some kind of demented gallery. I stepped inside just enough to get out of the rain, and that's when I realized what I was looking at. Missing person flyers, dozens and dozens of them. They weren't random or chaotic. Each flyer was meticulously placed with exactly 2 inches between them, held up by small brass pins that gleamed in my flashlight beam. Some of the faces looking back at me were familiar from news stories I half remembered. A college student from the state university who'd vanished after a party 3 years ago. A mother of 2 who'd disappeared from a grocery store parking lot. A teenage boy whose bike was found abandoned by the river. But most were strangers, their smiling photos clearly pulled from social media or family albums, frozen in happier moments before they became statistics. Underneath each flyer, in Douglas's cramped handwriting on strips of white label tape, were dates and locations written in red ink: November 3, 2018, Riverside Mall, or August 17, 2016, Greenwood Park, or January 22, 2024, corner of Madison and 3rd. My flashlight beam was shaking as I moved it across the walls, trying to process what I was seeing. In the corner, there was a metal filing cabinet with labels on each drawer, years going back over a decade. The top of the cabinet had a stack of newspapers, all folded to articles about missing persons, with certain sentences highlighted in yellow. I pulled open the top drawer of the filing cabinet with trembling fingers, and inside were manila folders, each one labeled with a name that matched the flyers on the walls. The first folder I grabbed belonged to a woman named Grace Holloway, who disappeared 2 years ago from a coffee shop downtown. Inside were printed screenshots of her social media profiles, photos that looked like they'd been taken from a distance showing her walking to her car or entering her apartment building, receipts from places she'd shopped, even what appeared to be a handwritten schedule of her daily routine. There was a map with red X marks at various locations around town, and at the bottom of the folder, a clear plastic sleeve containing a silver bracelet with a small charm shaped like a butterfly. My brain was screaming at me to run, to get out of there immediately, but I couldn't stop myself from reaching for another folder. This one was for a man named Robert Chu, missing since 2016, and it contained the same type of surveillance-like photos, the same obsessive documentation, and in the plastic sleeve at the back, a leather wallet with Robert's driver's license still inside. The sound of a car engine cutting through the storm made my entire body go rigid. Headlights swept across the side of the shed as Douglas's Camry pulled into his driveway, earlier than I'd expected him back. I shoved the folders back into the drawer and pushed it closed, but the metal made a loud screech that seemed to echo even over the rain. There was no time to get back to my house. I could already hear his car door slamming and his footsteps on the wet driveway. I did the only thing I could think of and pressed myself against the wall behind the door, trying to control my breathing as Douglas's silhouette appeared in the doorway. He stood there for what felt like forever, rain dripping off his jacket, head moving slowly from side to side like he was examining every inch of his collection. Then he spoke, not loudly but clear enough that I could hear every word over the storm. "I know someone's been in here. Things have been moved." He took a step inside and I could smell him. That mixture of hardware store dust and something medicinal, like hydrogen peroxide. His hand reached for a flashlight hanging on a hook right next to where I was hiding, his fingers inches from my face. Just then, a massive crack of thunder shook the entire shed, and the wind gusted so hard that it ripped the door from Douglas's grip and slammed it fully open against the outer wall, right where I was hidden. The door hit me hard in the shoulder, and I couldn't help the gasp that escaped my mouth. But the sound was completely swallowed by another roll of thunder and the shrieking wind. Douglas cursed and struggled to pull the door closed against the storm, giving me the 3 seconds I needed. I slipped out behind the door and into the rain, crouching low and moving as fast as I could toward the fence. I heard him yell something, but the storm was so loud I couldn't make out the words. I practically dove over the fence, landing hard in my own yard, and scrambled on my hands and knees to my back door. My fingers were so numb from the cold rain that I dropped my keys twice before managing to get inside. I locked the door, then the deadbolt, then shoved a chair under the doorknob for good measure. I spent the rest of that night sitting on my bathroom floor with my phone in my hand, trying to decide whether to call 911. What would I even say? That my neighbor had a creepy collection of missing person flyers. That wasn't illegal. The personal items in those folders, though, the surveillance photos, those had to mean something. But I had no proof, no photos of my own, and I'd been trespassing in his shed. Around 4 in the morning, I finally worked up the courage to peek through my bedroom blinds. Douglas was standing in his backyard, perfectly still in the rain, facing my house. He stayed there for another hour until the storm finally started to die down, then walked back to his shed and secured it with what looked like 3 new padlocks. The next morning, I called in sick to work again and drove straight to the police station. I told them everything, even admitted to trespassing, but the detective who took my statement seemed more concerned about my breaking and entering than anything else. He said they'd look into it, but without evidence of actual crimes, there wasn't much they could do about someone collecting newspaper clippings in their own shed. I packed my things that same afternoon, throwing everything into boxes without even wrapping the breakable stuff, just needing to get out of there as fast as possible. While I was loading my car, Douglas came out of his house and walked over, that mechanical smile plastered on his face. He asked if I was moving, and when I mumbled something about finding a place closer to work, he nodded slowly and said it was probably for the best, that the neighborhood could be dangerous for young women living alone. Then he handed me something, a missing person flyer fresh off a printer, with my photo from my social media profile staring back at me. Underneath the photo, in bold letters, it read, "Missing coming soon," with today's date written in his familiar red ink. I just stood there, unable to move or speak, while he walked back to his house whistling some old tune I didn't recognize. I drove straight to my parents' house 3 hours away and didn't stop shaking until I crossed the county line. I stayed with them for 2 weeks before finding a new apartment in their city, and I never went back to collect my security deposit or the few things I'd left behind. About a month later, I was finally starting to sleep through the night again when I saw a news article that made my whole body go numb. A woman named Claire Brennan had disappeared from Cedar Heights, last seen at a gas station about 6 blocks from my old rental house. The article mentioned that she was new to the area, lived alone, and had just started a job at a dental office downtown. But what really got me was the photo they used. I recognized it immediately as one I'd seen in Douglas's shed, already laminated and labeled with a date that was still 2 weeks in the future, when I'd seen it that night in November. I called the detective who'd taken my statement, gave him Claire's name and every detail I could remember, but he just said they'd add it to the file. They questioned Douglas apparently, even searched his shed with his permission, but found nothing except what the detective described as an extensive collection of public news materials related to his hobby of following missing persons cases. 2 more people disappeared from Cedar Heights over the next year, both young professionals who'd recently moved to the area, and Douglas still lives in that house. Still locks his shed every night at 9:15, probably with new folders and new photos that nobody will ever believe exist. People warn you about the dangers of living alone after a divorce, but nobody tells you how vulnerable you become when you're desperate for human connection. At 38, I found myself signing a lease for a small rental house on Sycamore Lane in early March of 2023, my belongings still packed in boxes that smelled like the marriage I'd just escaped. The neighborhood seemed perfect, quiet streets, mature oak trees, the kind of place where people still walked their dogs in the evening and waved at each other from their driveways. I remember thinking this was exactly what I needed to start over, away from the suffocating memories of my failed relationship with Amanda and the endless therapy sessions that couldn't save us. The first week was all about unpacking and trying to make the empty rooms feel less like a reminder of everything I'd lost. My furniture looked wrong in the new space, like actors on the wrong stage, and I spent hours rearranging things just to feel like I had some control over something in my life. I met Diane on my 4th day there, when she appeared at my door with a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil and a smile that seemed genuine enough to lower my guard. She must have been in her early 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that suggested she worked from home. Comfortable sweatpants and an oversized cardigan despite the warming weather. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Daniel," she said, and I remember being surprised she already knew my name, though I figured the landlord must have mentioned it or maybe she'd seen my mail. The lasagna she brought was incredible, layers of homemade pasta and a meat sauce that reminded me of Sunday dinners from childhood, and when I returned her dish the next day, she invited me in for coffee. Her house was the mirror image of mine but felt lived in, with photos covering every surface and the smell of vanilla candles mixing with something baking in the oven. She talked about the neighborhood gossip while refilling my cup 3 times, mentioning how the previous tenant of my house had left suddenly in the middle of the night, which she laughed off as probably just breaking a lease the wrong way. Over the next few weeks, Diane became a constant presence in my new routine, always appearing at just the right moments with exactly what I needed. When I came home exhausted from a particularly brutal day at the accounting firm, she'd knock with takeout from my favorite Thai place, pad ki mao with extra basil, just how I liked it, though I couldn't remember ever mentioning my preference to her. She helped me set up my home office, suggesting I put my desk by the window facing east because morning people like you work better with natural light. And somehow she was right about me being a morning person. The thing is, I'd been working remotely since the divorce, keeping odd hours to avoid thinking too much, so there was no way she could have noticed my schedule from normal neighbor observations. She even brought over a small potted orchid one afternoon, saying it would brighten up my workspace, and mentioned offhandedly that Amanda had never appreciated how hard I worked to provide for us. That stopped me cold, because I knew I hadn't told her my ex-wife's name. The little intrusions started to add up like drops of water, forming a flood I couldn't quite see yet. One evening, she texted me. I'd given her my number for emergencies, asking if I needed anything from the grocery store since she was heading out, and she listed items I was actually out of. Milk, eggs, that specific brand of whole grain bread I always bought, even the protein powder I used for my morning shakes. When I mentioned I'd been having trouble with my laptop running slowly, she showed up the next day with a USB drive containing the exact software I needed for my work, plus some extras she thought I might find useful. She knew I was allergic to shellfish without me ever mentioning it, always steering restaurant recommendations away from seafood places. Once she commented on how much better I looked since I'd stopped taking those anxiety medications that clearly weren't working anyway, but I kept my prescription bottles in my bathroom medicine cabinet, and she'd only ever been in my living room and kitchen. The moment that changed everything happened on a Saturday in early June, when Diane invited me over for dinner to meet her book club friends. Been hesitant, but figured it would be good to socialize, maybe meet more people in the neighborhood beyond just her. The dinner conversation was flowing normally, until one of her friends, a woman named Carol with thick glasses and a nervous laugh, mentioned she was a therapist at a practice downtown. "Oh, you must know Dr. Melissa Thornton then," Diane said casually while passing the salad. "She works at the same building, specializes in couples counseling. Daniel's ex-wife Amanda sees her every Wednesday at 4. The table went quiet, and I felt my fork slip from my fingers because not only had I never told Diane about Amanda's therapy, but those sessions were supposed to be from after our separation, something Amanda had started on her own. Carol looked confused and said she didn't think she should be discussing other doctors' patients, while I sat there trying to process how Diane could possibly know something that specific. I excused myself early that night, claiming a work deadline, but really I needed to get away from Diane and think through everything clearly. Back in my house, I started making a list of everything she knew that she shouldn't. My social security number. She'd mentioned the last 4 digits once while joking about identity theft. My mother's maiden name, brought it up when discussing family histories. The password to my Netflix account. She'd recommended shows that only appeared on my personal algorithm. And even the fact that I'd been browsing online dating profiles but hadn't messaged anyone yet. The more I wrote, the more my chest tightened with a feeling I hadn't experienced since the worst days of my marriage. That sensation of being watched, studied, like someone was taking notes on my life. I changed all my passwords that night, using my phone's data instead of my home Wi-Fi, and even put tape over my laptop camera, feeling paranoid but unable to shake the certainty that somehow she was monitoring everything I did. Monday morning, I called a locksmith while Diane was supposedly at her weekly yoga class, something she'd mentioned several times but I'd never actually seen her leave for. The locksmith, a young guy named Tommy with sleeves of tattoos and a reassuring professional demeanor, changed all 3 locks and installed a deadbolt on the back door. While he worked, he made small talk about the neighborhood, mentioning he'd done a lot of work on this street over the years. "Funny thing," he said while testing the new keys. "I changed these same locks about 8 months ago for the previous tenant. Same request too, wanted everything changed immediately, seemed pretty spooked about something." He handed me the new keys and advised me to consider a security system, maybe some cameras, which felt less paranoid and more practical after hearing about my predecessor. I spent the rest of that day working from a coffee shop downtown, unable to focus but needing to be away from the house while I processed everything. When I finally returned home that evening, there was a note taped to my door in Diane's distinctive handwriting, all loops and careful cursive like someone who'd won penmanship awards in school. "Daniel, noticed you had someone working on your door today. Hope everything's okay. Made extra portions of that chicken marsala you love. It's in your fridge. D." My blood turned to ice because I knew I'd locked the door when I left, and the new deadbolt was still engaged when I got back. Inside, sure enough, there was a covered plate in my refrigerator, still warm like it had just been placed there. I searched the entire house, checking windows, looking for any sign of how she'd gotten in, but everything was exactly as I'd left it except for that single plate of food. The chicken was even prepared without mushrooms, accommodating a preference I'd developed after a bad food poisoning incident 3 years ago that I'd never discussed with anyone in this neighborhood. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every creak and shadow, convinced I'd hear her trying the new locks or see her face at my bedroom window. Around 3 in the morning, my laptop suddenly brightened on my desk, the screen waking up despite being closed, and I saw notification after notification popping up on my phone about password reset attempts on accounts I'd forgotten I even had. My old MySpace page, a defunct dating profile from 2015, even my college alumni portal were all sending security alerts. Then my phone started showing me as active on WhatsApp, though I wasn't touching it, and I watched in horror as the typing indicator appeared in my conversation with my brother in Colorado. The message that sent itself said, "Everything's fine here, just can't sleep," which was technically true but not something I'd typed. I immediately turned off my Wi-Fi router and everything stopped, but when I looked at the available networks on my phone, there it was at the top of the list with full signal strength. "Welcome home, Daniel." The next morning, I knocked on Diane's door, determined to confront her despite not knowing exactly what I'd say or what proof I really had beyond circumstantial strangeness. She answered wearing an apron covered in flour, classical music playing softly from somewhere inside her house, looking every bit the harmless neighbor except for the way her eyes lit up like she'd been expecting me. "Daniel, perfect timing. I just pulled banana bread out of the oven. Your favorite with extra walnuts but no chocolate chips, just how you mentioned to your mother on the phone last week." I hadn't told her about that call, had made it from my car parked outside the office building specifically for privacy. When I asked her about the Wi-Fi network with my name, she tilted her head with this concerned expression that seemed practiced, rehearsed. "Oh, honey, that's been there since before you moved in. The previous tenant was also named Daniel Brennan. Such a coincidence, right? I never got around to changing it after he left." "Is it bothering you? I can update it if you'd like, though I'll need to reset all my smart home devices." The explanation was perfectly reasonable, except I'd looked up the previous tenant out of curiosity. His name was Christopher Vaughn. I decided to leave that very day, not permanently, but just to get some distance and clarity. Threw together a bag with a week's worth of clothes and my laptop, telling myself I'd stay at a hotel near my office while I figured out next steps. Maybe contacted a lawyer or the police, though I wasn't sure what crime I'd report exactly. As I loaded my car, Diane stood on her lawn watering plants that looked perfectly hydrated already, watching me with this serene smile like she knew something I didn't. "Taking a little trip?" she called out, and when I didn't respond, she added, "Drive safe, Daniel. That construction on Highway 47 can be brutal this time of day." Take Riverside Drive instead. Trust me." I hadn't mentioned which direction I was going, but she was right. There was construction on my usual route to downtown. At the hotel that night, 30 miles from Sycamore Lane, I finally felt like I could breathe again. I even laughed at myself a little, wondering if I was overreacting. If maybe she was just a lonely older woman with boundary issues and a few lucky guesses. Then I opened my laptop to do some work and found a new folder on my desktop labeled Memories, filled with photos I'd never seen before. Pictures of me sleeping in my bed taken from different angles, screenshots of my private conversations, even a video file of me singing in the shower from just that morning. The police took my report but seemed skeptical, especially when I admitted I had no idea how she'd gotten the photos or accessed my devices. They said they'd send someone to talk to her, but without concrete evidence of breaking and entering or explicit threats, there wasn't much they could do. I ended up breaking my lease, losing my security deposit but gaining peace of mind, and moved across town to a modern apartment building with security cameras, key card access, and a doorman named Paul who took his job seriously. For weeks afterward, I'd still get texts from unknown numbers with little details only she would know. Reminders to take my vitamins, warnings about traffic on my new commute, recipes for dishes I'd mentioned craving years ago. Eventually, they stopped. Or maybe I just got better at ignoring them. Last month, out of curiosity and against my better judgment, I drove past Sycamore Lane and saw a moving truck in front of my old house. There was a young couple carrying boxes inside, looking excited about their new beginning. And Diane was already there with what looked like a casserole dish, that same welcoming smile on her face. I wanted to warn them, but knew how crazy I'd sound, so I just drove away, though I sometimes check the local news, waiting to see their names appear in a story I hope never gets written. February changed everything for me, though it started out like any other month in that old brick building on Pine Street. My 27th birthday had just passed in January, and I'd been living alone in my third-floor apartment for about 2 months, finally making enough at the accounting firm downtown to afford a place without roommates. The apartment wasn't much to brag about, just a one-bedroom with creaky hardwood floors and windows that rattled whenever trucks rumbled past. But having my own space meant everything to me after years of sharing kitchens and bathrooms with strangers. The building itself had character, one of those pre-war constructions where you could hear every footstep, every conversation, every toilet flush from the neighboring units. The guy above me had moved in maybe 3 weeks after I did, and I only knew him as Nathan because that's what the super called him when they were fixing a leak in the hallway one afternoon. The footsteps started as something I barely noticed, just another layer of noise in a building full of sounds. But after a few days, I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. Whenever I walked from my bedroom to the kitchen, I'd hear the same path traced above me, the floorboards groaning in an identical rhythm. When I'd settle into my desk chair to work from home on Fridays, his chair would scrape against the floor directly overhead, like clockwork. I started experimenting, taking random routes through my apartment, walking in circles around my coffee table, stopping suddenly in the middle of the room, and each time, those footsteps above would mirror mine perfectly, never missing a beat. The rational part of my brain kept insisting our apartments must have the same layout, that we probably just had similar schedules since we both seemed to work from home, both stayed up late binge-watching shows until the early hours. The first note appeared on a Monday morning, slipped under my door while I was in the shower. Just a plain index card with neat handwriting in blue ink. Hope you're having a good morning. It's nice knowing someone else keeps the same weird hours as me. Nathan from upstairs. I actually smiled reading it, thinking how sweet it was that he'd reached out, and I spent the rest of the day drafting different responses in my head, though I never actually wrote one back. 2 days later, another note. The coffee shop on the corner makes the best blueberry muffins, just thought you should know. This time I left a thank you note taped to his door, keeping things friendly but brief. The notes became a regular thing. Every few days I'd find another one. Always cheerful, always signed the same way, talking about restaurant recommendations or commenting on the weather or making jokes about the couple next door and their Sunday morning arguments. For about 3 weeks, the notes felt like a bright spot in my routine, something that made living alone feel less isolating. Nathan seemed considerate, never knocked on my door directly, never tried to corner me in the hallway, just these little written hellos that I could respond to or ignore as I pleased. But then the tone shifted, so gradually I almost didn't notice at first. "You looked tired yesterday when you came home from work," one said, which seemed odd since I hadn't seen him that day, hadn't passed him in the hallway or anything. Another one read, "That phone call last night sounded stressful. Hope everything's okay," which made my chest tighten because I'd been talking to my mom about some personal stuff, speaking quietly in my bedroom with the door closed. The footsteps above me seemed louder now, more deliberate, and sometimes I'd hear him moving around at 3, 4 in the morning, pacing directly over wherever I happened to be. I started keeping track of the notes in a journal, trying to make sense of what was happening, documenting every strange detail. "You're not alone up here," said one that arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, and something about that phrasing made my skin prickle with unease. Not "you're not alone," which could mean he was just being neighborly, but up here like we were somehow sharing the same space, like the floor between us didn't exist. I began avoiding my apartment during the day, staying late at the office, taking longer routes home, anything to minimize the time I spent beneath those matching footsteps. But the notes kept coming, sometimes 2 in a single day, commenting on things that made no sense. "Your laugh is lovely. You should do it more often," when I hadn't laughed in days. "That green dress really suits you," when I'd worn it inside my apartment with the blinds drawn. The breaking point came on a Saturday night in late February, when I decided to confront him, or at least try to understand what was happening. I'd had a couple glasses of wine for courage, and marched up the stairs to the 4th floor, my heart hammering against my ribs as I stood outside his door. I knocked 3 times, firm but not aggressive, and waited. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time, and called out his name. Told him I knew he was home because I could literally hear him walking around up there 5 minutes ago. Still nothing, but I could hear movement inside, slow, careful footsteps approaching the door. I saw the peephole darken as he looked through it, and I stood there staring right back, waiting for him to open up, to explain himself, to do something. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, me standing in that dimly lit hallway, him watching me through that tiny lens, until finally I heard him step back and walk away, his footsteps fading into the depths of his apartment. That night changed something between us, like I'd broken some unspoken rule by going to his door. The notes stopped completely. No more index cards under my door. No more friendly observations about my life. But the footsteps got worse, more aggressive somehow, stomping instead of walking, following me from room to room with a determination that felt almost angry. I'd be brushing my teeth and hear him directly above my bathroom, the ceiling creaking under his weight. I'd crawl into bed and immediately hear his bed frame scraping against the floor overhead, positioning himself right above where I lay. I stopped sleeping properly, would doze off on the couch instead of my bed, but even then, I'd wake up to the sound of him settling onto his couch too, the springs groaning in perfect synchronization with mine. I called the super, Jerry, told him something weird was going on with Nathan upstairs, but Jerry just laughed and said Nathan was a model tenant, quiet guy, worked in IT, always paid rent on time. I tried explaining about the footsteps, the notes, the way he seemed to know everything about my daily routine. But Jerry looked at me like I was losing it, suggested maybe I was stressed from work, that apartment living took some getting used to. I even called the cops once when the footsteps were particularly bad, Nathan pacing in tight circles above my bed at 4 in the morning. But they said, unless he was threatening me directly or trying to break in, there wasn't much they could do about a neighbor being noisy. The female officer did seem concerned about the notes though, told me to keep them all, document everything, just in case things escalated. Then came the night I heard my name through the vent, and everything I'd been trying to rationalize came crashing down. It was a Friday, around midnight, and I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the sound of Nathan moving around upstairs. The footsteps had stopped about 10 minutes earlier, and I was just starting to relax when I heard it, soft but unmistakable, drifting down through the heating vent next to my bed. "Jessica," the voice whispered, drawing out each syllable like he was tasting the word. "Jessica, Jessica, Jessica," over and over, this quiet chanting that made my whole body go rigid with fear. I pressed my ear against the vent, thinking maybe I was imagining it, but no. It was definitely coming from above, his voice floating down through the metal ductwork, sometimes laughing softly between repetitions of my name. I grabbed my phone and started recording, needing proof that this was really happening, that I wasn't going crazy like everyone seemed to think. The recording picked up his voice clearly, that sing-song way he said my name, the little humming sounds he made between words. Then he said something that made my blood turn to ice water. "I know you're listening, Jessica. I can hear your breathing. We breathe together, you and me, in and out, in and out." And the horrifying thing was, he was right. I could hear his breathing through the vent, and without meaning to, I'd synchronized my own breathing with his, our inhales and exhales matching perfectly. I held my breath, trying to break the pattern, and immediately heard him laughing. This quiet, delighted sound like we were playing a game and I'd just made a really good move. That was it for me. I couldn't stay there another second. I threw on sweatpants and a hoodie over my pajamas, shoved my phone and wallet into my pockets and ran out of my apartment, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night in my car in a Walmart parking lot, calling every friend I could think of, trying to find someone who'd let me crash at their place for a few days. My friend Brittany finally answered, said I could stay with her as long as I needed, and I drove straight there, showing up at her door at 3 in the morning looking absolutely wrecked. I played her the recording from my phone, and the look on her face told me everything. This wasn't normal, wasn't something I was imagining. This was genuinely terrifying, and I needed to get out of that apartment immediately. I never went back alone after that night. Brittany and her boyfriend came with me that Sunday afternoon to pack up my stuff, and Nathan must have known we were there because the footsteps started the moment we walked in, following us from room to room as we threw my belongings into boxes and trash bags. At one point, Brittany's boyfriend, Mike, got fed up and started yelling at the ceiling, telling Nathan to cut it out, that we knew what he was doing, that the cops had been notified. The footsteps stopped for about 30 seconds, then resumed, but slower, more deliberate, like he was savoring his last chance to mirror my movements. We got everything out in under 2 hours, and as I was doing a final walkthrough, I found one last note that must have been slipped under the door while we were packing. "You'll always be right below me, no matter where you go." I kept that note, added it to my collection of evidence, though I never did anything with it. Never pressed charges or anything. Just wanted to forget the whole thing ever happened. I broke my lease, lost my security deposit, but it was worth it to get away from there, to sleep without wondering if someone was standing directly above me, breathing in sync with my every breath. When I moved into that cul-de-sac, it felt like stepping into one of those 2 perfect postcards you find in realtor offices. Every house looked nearly identical: beige paint, trimmed hedges, wreaths that changed with the season. I had been looking for somewhere quiet after ending a long-term relationship and quitting my job in the city. The idea of starting fresh somewhere peaceful sounded like exactly what I needed. The first morning after unpacking, I woke up to a knock on the door and found a woman in her 50s holding a casserole dish big enough to feed 6 people. She introduced herself as Mrs. Hayworth from across the street and said the neighbors were so thrilled to have me join their little community. That afternoon, 3 more people stopped by. There was a couple named Gina and Mark who lived next door, both wearing matching aprons from some local barbecue event, and an older man named Earl, who seemed to be in charge of the neighborhood watch. They all repeated the same line in slightly different tones. "We like to keep everyone close around here." At the time, I thought it was just small-town friendliness. They talked about a monthly potluck at the end of every month and insisted I come. Even when I said I was still settling in, they assured me they'd make room. It was hard not to feel a little pressured, but I told myself it was harmless. Within a week, I noticed something strange about how synchronized the neighborhood seemed. Trash cans rolled out at the exact same time. Lawns got mowed in perfect unison, right down to the sound of engines starting within seconds of each other. Even their mailboxes looked recently polished. I figured they were just the kind of people who took pride in appearances, but the more I watched, the more it felt rehearsed. Every time I pulled out of my driveway, at least one of them happened to be outside, waving, smiling, pretending to garden. It started to feel less like coincidence and more like surveillance. The first potluck came sooner than I expected. The whole cul-de-sac turned into a parade of folding tables, fairy lights, and slow cookers. Everyone brought something homemade and stood in a perfect circle like it was choreographed. When I showed up with a store-bought pie, a few people chuckled softly, not unkindly, but just enough to make me feel out of place. Mrs. Hayworth clapped me on the back and said, "You'll get the hang of it soon enough." That night, as I helped clean up, I caught Gina whispering something to Mark while glancing in my direction. She smiled when our eyes met. A little too wide, a little too long. After that night, the friendliness intensified. Whenever I went for a walk, someone would appear by chance. Earl would be sweeping his driveway, Mark would be trimming hedges, or Gina would step out just to water plants that were already soaked. Once I drove to a grocery store 2 towns over and came back to find a pie on my doorstep with a note that said, "We missed you today." The handwriting looked familiar. Neat loops like Mrs. Hayworth's, but the signature was unsigned. I told myself they were just trying to be kind, but the way they always knew where I had been made my chest feel tight every time I turned into that street. About a month later, I was coming home late from a weekend trip. Every house was dark except mine, where my porch light flickered even though I had never left it on. The motion sensor light across the street blinked too, as if reacting to something I couldn't see. As I stepped out of my car, I heard faint laughter, not loud but close enough to carry through the hedges. When I turned around, all the curtains in Earl's house were drawn except one narrow slit, and behind it, a shadow moved. I stood there for a while, pretending to look for my keys, waiting for whoever was watching to move away. The shadow didn't. It just stayed there, still, like it was waiting for me to go inside first. The next morning, I found a stack of flyers taped neatly to my front door. Each one was identical. Neighborhood potluck, attendance encouraged. What unsettled me most was that my name had been written by hand at the bottom of each flyer, in different handwriting. One looked like Earl's, another like Gina's, and one even had the same perfect loops as Mrs. Hayworth's notes. I tore them all down and threw them in the trash, but later that day, as I took out the bin, the flyers were back, folded neatly on top of the lid. Someone had been on my property again. That night, I locked every door and window before going to bed. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on my porch. The boards creaked in a slow, measured rhythm. One step, a pause, then another. I held my breath, too scared to move. After a few moments, the sound stopped, followed by the faint scrape of something sliding under my door. I waited until morning to check. On the floor lay an envelope, unmarked, sealed with tape. Inside was a single sheet of paper, every neighbor's handwriting combined into one chilling sentence. "We're so happy you finally fit in." I packed a bag that morning, convinced I was leaving. But before I could load my car, Mrs. Hayworth appeared on the sidewalk with her usual calm smile. She said she noticed my light had been on late and wanted to check in. Behind her, Earl leaned on his mailbox, pretending to read the paper. Gina waved from her porch. It was as if they had all appeared at once, positioned in a triangle around me. I forced a smile and told her I was visiting family. She tilted her head and said, "Good. Family's important here." Then she gestured toward the envelope still on my porch. "We're so glad you got our note." That night, I checked into a cheap motel 15 miles away. When I turned on the television, a local commercial played, an advertisement for the Crestfield Homeowners Association, showing the same street I had just left. Everyone was there, smiling and waving, standing in front of their houses. For a split second, I thought I saw myself too. Same clothes, same hair, standing among them and smiling like I belonged. The screen glitched, and when it cleared, my image was gone. I called the police the next morning to request a welfare check on the neighborhood. The officer I spoke to said there was no record of a Crestfield court in that area, only a wooded lot with an old access road that hadn't been maintained for years. I even drove back to confirm it myself, and he was right. There was nothing there but overgrown grass and cracked pavement leading into the trees. No houses, no mailboxes, no neighbors. Just silence. I have since moved twice, and I still find things in my mailbox that I never ordered. Birthday cards signed by people I never met. Grocery flyers from a town that doesn't exist. The most recent envelope arrived last week. No return address. Inside was a short note written in the same mixture of handwritings as before. "We're so happy you never left." Last July, at 32 years old, I finally had enough saved up to move into Westbrook Gardens, one of those gated communities you see advertised with perfect lawns and smiling families. I'd been living in cramped apartments since college, dealing with noisy neighbors and broken elevators, so this felt like a massive upgrade. The house wasn't huge, just a modest 2-story with beige siding and a decent backyard, but it was mine. I remember driving through those security gates for the first time with my U-Haul, feeling like I'd finally made it somewhere in life. The guard, an older guy named Harold with thick glasses and a permanent squint, gave me this strange little nod and wrote something down on his clipboard. I didn't think much of it then, just figured he was logging new residents or something routine like that. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for after years of apartment living. Quiet streets, kids riding bikes, people walking their dogs in the evening. On my third night there, while I was still surrounded by boxes and eating takeout Chinese food straight from the container, my doorbell rang around 8. Standing there was this group of 5 people, all probably in their 60s or 70s, wearing matching yellow reflective vests with Neighborhood Watch printed across the back. The woman in front, who introduced herself as Dorothy, had this oversized smile and held a plate of chocolate chip cookies that looked store-bought but were arranged on a fancy glass plate. Behind her stood 2 men and 2 other women, all holding walkie-talkies on their belts and carrying these leather-bound notebooks. Dorothy explained they were the official Westbrook Gardens Neighborhood Watch, established in 1987, and they wanted to personally welcome me and invite me to join their group. I invited them in because it seemed rude not to, even though I really just wanted to finish my lo mein and unpack my kitchen stuff. They all filed into my living room and sat down on my one assembled couch without being asked, arranging themselves in this weirdly precise formation, like they'd done this exact thing hundreds of times before. Dorothy did most of the talking, explaining how they met every Monday and Friday at 7 sharp, and that they had a special midnight meeting once a month for what she called priority matters. The way she said it, emphasizing those 2 words while the others nodded in perfect unison, made me uncomfortable. One of the men, who never actually introduced himself but had a name tag that said Eugene, kept writing in his notebook the entire time, his pen moving even when nobody was talking. I tried to peek at what he was writing, but he'd angle the notebook away whenever I shifted my position. They stayed for exactly 30 minutes, and I mean exactly, because when Dorothy's watch beeped at 8:30, all 5 of them stood up simultaneously like they were controlled by the same brain. Before leaving, Dorothy handed me a thick packet of papers, maybe 40 pages, all about Neighborhood Watch protocols and responsibilities. She said I should read through everything and let her know by Friday if I wanted to join, adding that participation was strongly encouraged for community harmony. The phrase stuck with me because of how she said it, like she was reciting something she'd memorized. After they left, I flipped through the packet and found pages of rules about patrol schedules, incident reporting procedures, and this whole section about maintaining neighborhood standards that seemed weirdly aggressive for a volunteer group of retirees. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to get familiar with the area and maybe meet some neighbors who weren't part of the geriatric patrol squad. That's when I started noticing the symbols. At first, I thought it was just a weird coincidence, but every single house had this same marking, carved into the wood near their mailbox post. It looked like 3 intersecting circles with a triangle in the middle, about the size of a quarter, carved deep enough that it had to be intentional. Some looked fresh and clean, others were painted over but still visible underneath, and a few were so old the wood had darkened around them. I checked at least 20 houses on my street and the next one over, and every single one had it. Mine didn't, which suddenly made me feel exposed, like my house was advertising that I didn't belong there yet. I spent the rest of the week avoiding Dorothy and her crew, which turned out to be harder than expected in a gated community. They seemed to be everywhere, always walking in pairs with their vests and walkie-talkies, always taking notes on those leather notebooks. On Wednesday, I was coming home from work when I saw Eugene and another watch member standing in front of my house, just staring at my mailbox. When they saw me pulling into my driveway, they waved like nothing was weird about 2 old men examining my property at 6 in the evening. Eugene actually walked over to my car window and asked if I'd had a chance to review the packet, reminding me that Friday was the deadline to respond. His breath smelled like mothballs and something medicinal, and he stood way too close to my car door, basically trapping me until I promised I'd look at it that night. Friday came and I still hadn't given Dorothy an answer, mostly because the whole thing gave me the creeps, and I figured they'd just leave me alone if I ignored them long enough. Around 7 that evening, right when their regular meeting would be starting, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and saw Dorothy standing there alone. No smile this time, just this blank expression that made her look like a completely different person. I didn't answer, just stayed quiet and waited for her to leave. She rang the bell 2 more times, then knocked with this slow, methodical rhythm that went on for about 30 seconds. Then she spoke, loud enough that I could hear her clearly through the door, saying that my absence was noted and that the community was disappointed in my lack of participation. She used that exact word, disappointed, drawing it out like she was talking to a misbehaving child. After she finally left, I watched through my window as she walked down my driveway and met up with the rest of the watch group who had been waiting by the street the entire time. They huddled together for a minute, all of them looking back at my house, then dispersed in different directions like they were following some predetermined route. That night, I couldn't sleep well, kept hearing noises outside, footsteps on the sidewalk, whispers that might have been the wind or might have been something else. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and went to check my security camera footage from earlier, just to make sure I wasn't being paranoid. What I saw made me wish I'd never bought this house. Starting at exactly midnight, there were 12 people standing at the end of my driveway, all wearing those yellow reflective vests, all facing my house, completely motionless for 1 hour and 13 minutes before they all turned and walked away at the same time. Saturday morning, I called the security company that managed the gates, trying to report what happened without sounding completely insane. The woman on the phone, who sounded bored and half asleep, told me that the Neighborhood Watch was a sanctioned group with full authority to patrol the community at any hour. When I pushed back, saying that standing in my driveway at midnight wasn't patrolling, she got quiet for a moment, then said something that chilled me more than seeing those people on my camera. She said that according to their records, I was already a registered member of the Neighborhood Watch as of Friday night, and that my initiation period would last 90 days. I told her I never signed up for anything, never agreed to join, but she insisted their records showed my verbal consent was given to Dorothy at 7:15 the previous evening, right around the time she was knocking on my door that I never answered. I spent the rest of Saturday researching Westbrook Gardens online, trying to find anyone else who'd had similar experiences. But every review was glowing. Every social media post showed happy families and community barbecues. The only odd thing I found was a death notice from 2015 about a resident named Andrew Garrett who had died in a house fire, specifically noted as living at my exact address. More searching revealed that in the past 20 years, my specific house had changed owners 7 times, which seemed excessive even for a transient area. Each previous owner had lived there less than a year, and I couldn't find any of them online afterward, like they just vanished after moving out. That afternoon, while I was deep in this rabbit hole of research, my doorbell rang again, but this time it was just a package delivery, except I hadn't ordered anything. Inside the package was a yellow reflective vest with my last name already printed on the back, a leather-bound notebook exactly like the ones they all carried, a walkie-talkie preset to channel 7, and a small wood-carving tool with a note that simply said, "For your mailbox, complete by Monday." The precision of the threat hidden in that mundane instruction made me realize I was dealing with something far more organized and dangerous than a group of bored retirees. That night, I started packing essential items into my car, planning to stay at a hotel until I could figure out what to do. Maybe contact a lawyer or even the police outside the community. But when I tried to leave around 10 that night, the security gate wouldn't open. Harold, the guard from my first day, walked over to my car with that same strange squint and informed me that new watch members weren't permitted to leave the community during their initiation period, except for work-related purposes, and only then with written documentation of their employment schedule. I abandoned my car and walked back to my house, my mind racing through options that all seemed equally useless against whatever this was. The moment I got inside, I called my brother in Arizona, told him everything, and asked him to come get me, to bring the police if necessary. He said he'd drive through the night and be there by morning. I stayed up all night with every light in my house on, baseball bat in hand, watching those security cameras like my life depended on it. At exactly midnight, they came again, but this time there were at least 20 of them, maybe more, all standing in that same perfect formation at the end of my driveway. Dorothy was in front this time, and even through the grainy camera footage, I could see she was holding something that looked like a folder or clipboard, moving her mouth like she was reading something out loud to the others. My brother arrived at 7:30 Sunday morning with 2 cops from the county sheriff's department, and that's when everything finally broke open. The guards at the gate tried to refuse them entry, citing community bylaws, but the cops weren't having any of it and threatened to arrest Harold for obstruction. Once they got to my house and I showed them the security footage, things moved fast. Turns out the FBI had been monitoring Westbrook Gardens for 2 years, suspecting it was some kind of cult that used the homeowners association as a front. The whole neighborhood watch thing was their recruitment method, and those who refused to join after buying property, there would face increasing harassment until they either joined or abandoned their homes, which the group would then buy through shell companies and resell to new potential members. The symbols, the midnight gatherings, the 90-day initiation period, it was all part of their indoctrination process. By noon, there were federal agents everywhere, arresting Dorothy and 43 other residents, including Harold and most of the watch group I'd met. They found detailed records in Dorothy's house showing 8 previous owners of my house who had all fled within their first year, and Andrew Garrett, the one who died in the fire, had apparently been trying to expose them to law enforcement. I gave my statement, packed everything I could fit in my brother's truck, and left that afternoon, not even bothering to properly close on selling the house, just wanting to get as far away as possible. The FBI agent handling my case called me a month later to say I'd likely saved myself from something much worse, as they'd found evidence of financial crimes, identity theft, and what he carefully called other concerning activities that he couldn't discuss. I took a massive financial loss on that house, but I'm alive, living in a normal apartment with normal neighbors who don't wear matching vests or stand in my driveway at midnight. And honestly, that's worth more than any dream house could ever be.